Here is where we left off the previous video with ancient Greece, where they had made a massively important intellectual move with respect to ethics, with respect to knowledge in general. And that is that knowledge of the world, knowledge of human affairs, knowledge of ethics no longer depended on faith, no longer depended on religion. That human beings could know these things. And there we have the image of Prometheus giving the fire of knowledge to human beings, though he had been prohibited from doing this by Zeus. Representing this fire, representing ancient Greece's drive, their ambition for secular knowledge. They wanted to know about the world and about human affairs. They believed this was fundamental for human civilization, certainly in the West, that human beings could discover knowledge by themselves and for themselves. They did not depend for this knowledge on divinity or sacred texts. They could discover it through work on their own. Then comes Thales, roughly 600 before the Common Era, considered by many scholars to be the father of Western philosophy. He and other pre-Socratic philosophers, thinkers, grew up in port cities, where many cultures came to trade, cities that had accumulated a certain amount of wealth, where a certain class of people had leisure, enough leisure to think about things. Thales and others of his era began to ask new questions. They were frustrated with the old questions of the religious questions of who and why, how the universe had been created, or why the universe had been created and by whom. They had for generations heard many different stories from all the different Mediterranean cultures about who and why. Who had created the universe and humankind? What were the reasons for this? Why was it done? None of these stories could be proven. They all seemed plausible, but they were all completely contradictory. So Western philosophy is, in essence, born because Thales and some of his contemporaries began to ask new questions. They asked questions about the world. They set aside questions about faith and about religion and began to ask questions about the world around them. Instead of who and why, they asked questions of what and how. What is out there in the world? What is the world made of? And how does it all work? This went on for some generations, but it is difficult to prevent human beings in advanced societies from thinking about questions of who and why. And a school of thought called the Sophists came into existence roughly 500 to 400 before the Common Era. Those Sophists existed before and existed later. They returned to these questions of who and why, but they didn't ask them in a religious sense. They asked about government and politics. They wanted to know how to manage the polis, that is, the unit, the administrative and political unit of the Greek Empire and the Mediterranean world, the city-state. They wanted to know what is the best way to govern a polis, what is right and good and fair and just in government and politics. They studied systematically the governments and political systems of the city-states and cultures of the Mediterranean world. And what was their conclusion? That it's all relative. It is all relative. It's just a matter of opinion and custom. These things vary from place to place, and in each place, philosophers and government officials argue persuasively about the legitimacy of their system, different from other systems. The Sophists decided there were no fixed criteria, no standards for evaluating these different proposals for government and politics, no way to make a final decision about which was best. So their conclusion was that it's all relative. But then come the Greek greats, roughly 460 before Christ to 320 before Christ. Socrates and his student Plato and his student Aristotle. They were, in essence, the real founders of Western philosophy, the first in-depth, systematic treatment of many questions of philosophy, including ethics. They were definitely anti-sophist. They believed that the good, the right, the just, the true, these things can be known. In fact, they are the good, the right, the just, and the true. They were very much of the opinion that answers to the big questions of human life, of human existence, that these are not relative. They are not a matter of mere opinion and custom. The Greek greats believed that these questions have certain and provable answers, that through study they can be found. The good life for the Greek greats is a life dedicated to studying the big questions of human existence, discovering the answers, and putting them into practice. Socrates and Plato were idealists. They felt that truth lay in the realm of ideas. In fact, they determined that there was a realm of the forms where the perfect essence of all things exists. The very form of the good, what is good, exists in the realm of the forms, and in its perfect configuration. Their model of knowledge was mathematics. Aristotle was more an empiricist. Yes, the forms exist, but they are in things and in the world. His model of knowledge was observation, natural science, and logic. There are very important similarities and maybe even more important differences among these philosophers, but the key for our purposes here is that they believed these three things. First, ethics is knowable. They had the first systematic and comprehensive and profound arguments describing, even proving, they felt, proving ethical positions, the first that we know of. And returning to this point, ethics, number two, ethics is not necessarily based on religious belief or the sacred or divine command. This for the first time in human civilization. We do not depend on gods, goddesses, or the gods or their texts to know what the right thing to do is. We can determine it for ourselves. And number three, they offered what might be known as the first cake and ice cream critique of ethics that is based on religious belief. What do we mean by this? Well, let's say that John and Mary have cake and ice cream for dessert after dinner every day. Their mother says to John, "John, if you help Mary with her homework, you can have more cake after dinner. So John helps Mary with her homework. Their father says to Mary, Mary, if you don't help John with his homework, you cannot have ice cream after dinner for dessert. So Mary helps John with his homework. Are John and Mary acting ethically? Did John act ethically, or did he act to get a reward? Did Mary act ethically, or did she act to avoid punishment? The Greek greats were the first to raise this issue about religious belief, about faith. If a person acts based on faith in order to gain the rewards promised by his or her faith, is she or he acting ethically or acting in his or her own self-interest? Is he or she trying to get into heaven or have a good rebirth in order to receive the rewards promised by religion? If a person acts in a certain way but does so to avoid punishment, the punishment prescribed by the person's religious faith, damnation or hell or other sorts of punishments, is that person acting ethically? Or is she or he acting in her or his own self-interest to avoid punishment? There are many and sophisticated arguments on both sides of this question throughout the centuries, but these Greek thinkers were the first to really raise it as an issue that religious faith needs to wrestle with. Along comes Jesus Christ, then Christianity, and the combination of Greek and Christian thinking dominate philosophy in the West and ethical thinking in Western civilization for 1,500 years. Many would argue that they still do. But things did change, began to change around the 14th and 15th centuries with the Renaissance, and then afterwards during the age of science, and then again, for our purposes, for ethics, and during the Enlightenment, roughly the 18th century. The Enlightenment being an exponent of the belief that human beings and society, ethics and politics can be understood and improved through the same methods of science that had been used during the age of science, through systematic study, the application of scientific principles, as had been successfully done in astronomy, physics, chemistry, mathematics by Newton and other great scientific thinkers. We jump then, following to a certain significant degree Enlightenment belief, we jump to the 18th and 19th centuries, and two big names who still play a massive role in much of our thinking about ethics. Sometimes at the same time, they play a significant role in our personal decisions about ethical dilemmas we might face, as well as in public policy decisions made by governments and politicians in determining the right and wrong, the good and evil of different kinds of public decisions. These two names are Kant, today called deontology, rules-based ethics, and the utilitarians, today frequently known as consequentialism, an interest in the results of decisions for judging their ethical content.